Today, autopsies are a gory but necessary part of forensic science, but 100 years ago they were far from routine. The mystery of how a person died often went with them to the grave. Gradually, though, forward-thinking police officers started to realise its importance and began to use autopsy results in their investigations. Cases that would never have seen the light of day went to trial. In tonight's casebook, we're going to look at two sensational investigations. One would fuel our love affair with forensic science, the other would nearly destroy it.
London, December 1914. As Britain approached its first Christmas of the Great War, Fleet Street buzzed with the news of the Western Front, and there was talk of little else. In Highgate, on the evening of December the 18th, landlady Louisa Blatch was ironing in her kitchen. Upstairs were her guests, Mr. John Lloyd and his new bride, Margaret. Margaret was running her evening bath. Louisa heard splashing coming from the bathroom, then a noise. She said it sounded like someone putting wet hands or arms on the side of the bath. Then she heard a sigh. As Louisa carried on ironing, she heard someone playing the harmonium in the sitting room. And then the front door slammed. Mr. Lloyd had gone out. About 10 minutes later, Mr. Lloyd returned and asked if his wife had come downstairs after her bath. "Not yet," said Louisa. He headed upstairs, calling her name. Suddenly, Louisa heard frantic cries from the bathroom. She raced up the stairs. Slumped in the bath was the lifeless body of newlywed Margaret. Her marriage had lasted just 36 hours.
Margaret's inquest was straightforward. A bout of influenza combined with a hot bath had probably caused an attack of syncope, in other words, a fainting fit. Unconscious, she drowned in her own bath. The coroner recorded a verdict of accidental death. The papers were quick to pick up on the story.
At the time, cases like this made headline news. The 20th century saw a huge rise in the popularity of newspapers. By 1914, people were reading and collecting clippings from them like never before. And because of this, our story now takes an astonishing turn. A couple of days after Margaret's death hit the headlines, two newspaper cuttings made it onto the desk of Detective Inspector Arthur Neal at Scotland Yard. One was the inquest report, the other a coroner's report from a local paper in Blackpool. Just over a year before, another young woman, Alice Smith, had died in remarkably similar circumstances.
She too was a new bride. She too had apparently drowned in the bath after a fit or a faint. She too had been found dead by her new husband. Another tragic accident?
Inspector Neal didn't hang about. Within hours, he had returned to the Highgate guest house of Louisa Blatch. Louisa told the inspector as much as she could about her former tenant. His most notable feature, she said, were his horrible staring eyes, capable of drilling right through you. She told of how carefully Mr. Lloyd had inspected the bathroom before renting the room and what had happened on the night of the drowning. Inspector Neal was a thorough man. He took careful measurements of the bathtub. Could a grown woman really drown accidentally in such a small tub? The inspector had his doubts.
Next, the inspector set about tracking down his suspect. He discovered that just 2 weeks before her death, Margaret Lloyd had taken out life insurance. The insurance company had recently been contacted by a Mr. Lloyd who wanted to claim his money. This was the perfect opportunity to bring him in for questioning.
On February the 1st, 1915, the police arrested John Lloyd, real name George Smith. He'd been married before, 2 years earlier, to Alice Burnham, also dead, also drowned in her bath. Both his wives had life insurance. Both had left everything to Smith in the event of their deaths. It was all very suspicious. And there was more. It turned out Smith had been married 7 times, all bigamous save one, and chillingly his fourth wife, Bessie Munday, had died unexpectedly, drowned in her bath. 3 of his 7 wives were dead.
Suddenly, the police had a suspected serial killer on their hands, and a rich one at that. Through the deaths of all 3 brides, Smith had amassed a small fortune, in today's money the equivalent of £300,000. Inspector Neal had his suspect. He had 3 victims, And now he also had a motive.
But there was a problem. The law said that no defendant, even a suspected mass murderer, could face more than one charge at a time. The prosecution would have to prove that one of the victims had drowned not by accident, but by force. This was beyond ordinary policing. It would require the skills of Bernard Spilsbury. Spilsbury was among an elite group of pathologists working in London, making a name for themselves on some of the most taxing and gruesome murders of the time.
The years between about 1900 and 1925 were a key period in the development of forensic medicine. Forensic pathologists, forensic pathology really began to gain a very high public profile. Murder cases really gripped the public's imagination, and the press were all over these cases.
Bernard Spilsbury had come to the public's attention 5 years before on the Crippen murder. Since then, he'd become an indispensable part of police forensics, performing around 1,000 autopsies a year. But drowning was and is an extremely tough cause of death to prove. And even Spilsbury, with all his experience, would struggle with this one. To find out what Spilsbury was up against, I've come to meet Home Office pathologist Dr. Stuart Hamilton, Spilsbury's modern-day equivalent.
In a case of drowning, the first place that we would look would be the lungs themselves, and you're looking to see if there might be any liquid in them, any froth coming up the airways from a mixture of air and water. Unfortunately, the lungs can get filled with water in all manner of causes of death. It can happen in heart failure, it can happen in people who've taken drug overdoses. So it may give you a clue, but you can't be absolutely certain.
So that's your first port of call?
Yes. You then move on to look in the stomach. As you can imagine, if someone's struggling for air as they're drowning, they swallow a lot of water. So you can see that the stomach itself would be filled with water.
This is a horrible way to die, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Right. So after the stomach, what do we do next?
Well, that's really all that you can look at specifically for drowning, but you'd carry on to look and see if there may be another reason why somebody was dead. So maybe they'd died of a heart attack or a brain hemorrhage.
So Spilsbury came up with no clues at all about what it was?
Not at all.
He had to look for alternative theories
Indeed.
of death. And would you say that your job is any different now than it was in those days?
No, essentially, we go through the same process. I'm sure if Sir Bernard came into the mortuary where I was working today, he'd recognise almost everything that we do.
Spilsbury ordered the exhumation of all 3 bodies, but after thorough autopsies, he was no closer to finding a cause of death. As far as he was concerned, the women were perfectly healthy when they got in the bath. There was nothing to suggest they'd been drowned by force. Spilsbury went back to his books. How could Smith have done it?
There, buried in the medical journals, he found what he was looking for.
The vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is a long and complicated nerve running from the brain through the face and thorax to the stomach. Sudden pressure on the vagus nerve can have a startling effect. A stranglehold, a karate chop, or crucially, a sudden rush of water up the nose can trigger unconsciousness. It would then be relatively simple to hold a person under long enough to drown them.
The pathologist was convinced he'd hit upon the cause of death, but how had Smith actually done it? This was Spilsbury's theory. Smith had been kneeling by the bathtub, perhaps caressing his wife for a few moments before, placing his right hand on her forehead and his left beneath her knees. Then with a sudden jackknife motion, he jerked the legs up and pushed the head under the water. The rush of water up the nose would render her unconscious and she would drown.
Inspector Neal seized on the theory. With the help of a willing volunteer, he attempted to submerge her by pushing down on her head and shoulders. No matter how hard he tried, she was able to stay above water. Then, without warning, the inspector seized the volunteer's feet and yanked her under the water. She went instantly limp. In a panic, she was hauled out, and frantic attempts were made to resuscitate the poor woman. Mercifully, she choked back to life. A very close call. But the prosecution now had their case. George Joseph Smith was tried at the Old Bailey. The Brides in the Bath murders caused an absolute sensation, grabbing the headlines of every paper and knocking World War I off the front page. As huge crowds gathered outside the courtroom, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They took just 22 minutes to find George Smith guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death and hanged on the 13th of August 1915.
This was a landmark investigation for forensic science. Never before had police and forensics worked side by side throughout a case. Their close collaboration had produced a plausible theory for cause of death with dramatic evidence to support it. Forensic science had truly come of age.